The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square of Redemption Creek, Texas, in 1867. Sarah Whitefeather stood on a makeshift wooden platform, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. Around her neck hung a crude placard with the number 7 scrawled in black paint. Her dark eyes blazed with defiance even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was 17 years old, the last surviving member of her Comanche family, and she refused to let these men see her fear. The auctioneer, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, grabbed her arm roughly and yanked her forward. "Step right up, gentlemen. Here we have a strong young native girl, good for cleaning, cooking, and field work. Bidding starts at $1. Sarah's jaw clenched. This couldn't be happening. Just 3 weeks ago, she had been free, riding across the plains with her grandmother, gathering medicinal herbs and laughing at the hawks circling overhead. Then the soldiers came. Her grandmother had hidden her in a root cellar, sacrificing herself to buy Sarah time. But time had run out. They found her, declared her a ward of the state, and now here she stood, being sold like livestock in a town that reeked of whiskey and prejudice. $1, called out a rancher with a cruel smile. $1.50, shouted another, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Sarah scanned the crowd, seeing nothing but hard faces and harder hearts. Men who looked at her and saw only labor, only property. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, "You carry the spirit of your ancestors, little bird. No one can cage what lives in your heart." $2. The voice came from the back of the crowd, young and uncertain. The auctioneer squinted into the sun. "Sold. To the cowboy in the back. $2 for the girl." As the crowd dispersed with disappointed grumbles, a young man emerged from the shadows. He couldn't have been more than 22, with sandy hair that fell into earnest blue eyes and a face that still held traces of boyhood. He wore dusty trail clothes and carried himself with the awkward uncertainty of someone who had just made a decision he didn't fully understand. His name was Thomas McKenna, and his hands trembled slightly as he counted out $2 silver into the auctioneer's greedy palm. Thomas approached the platform hesitantly. Up close, he could see the fierce intelligence in Sarah's eyes, the proud set of her shoulders despite her circumstances. He reached out to help her down from the platform, but she jerked away from his touch. "Don't," she hissed, her English perfect and sharp as a blade. "I may have been sold, but I am not your property. I am not anyone's property." Thomas withdrew his hand quickly, his face flushing red. I didn't mean." "What did you mean?" Sarah demanded, stepping down from the platform on her own, even with her hands still bound. She stood before him, chin raised, every inch of her small frame radiating defiance. "You paid money for a human being. What exactly were your intentions, cowboy?" Thomas looked stricken. He fumbled with the knot on her wrists, finally managing to free them. Sarah rubbed the raw skin, never taking her eyes off his face, watching for any sign of the cruelty she had learned to expect. "My name is Thomas McKenna," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the dispersing crowd. "And I didn't know what else to do. If I hadn't bid, one of those other men would have bought you. Men who would have." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Sarah understood perfectly. She had seen the hunger in some of those faces, hunger for power, for domination, for something darker she didn't want to name. "So you're my savior, then?" Sarah's voice dripped with sarcasm. "My noble rescuer. And now what? I'm supposed to be grateful. Supposed to serve you with a smile because you were slightly less terrible than the alternatives." Thomas's shoulders sagged. He looked utterly lost, like a boy playing at being a man and suddenly realizing he was in far over his head. "No," he said finally. "No, you're not supposed to do anything. I have a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. It's not much, just a cabin and some land I'm trying to work. I thought, maybe you could stay there until you figure out where you want to go." What you want to do? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, pressing it into her hands. This is everything I have left after buying supplies, about $15. It's not much, but it might help you get to California, or Mexico, or wherever you want to go. Sarah stared at the pouch in her hands, then back at Thomas's face. She had been prepared for violence, for degradation, for a fight to the death if necessary. She had not been prepared for this, for genuine kindness in the eyes of a stranger, for an offer of freedom from the man who had just purchased her. Why? The single word carried the weight of all her confusion, all her suspicion, all the grief and anger of the past 3 weeks. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Because my mother was Irish. She came to this country as an indentured servant, basically a slave with a fancier name. She used to tell me stories about the humiliation of it, the helplessness. She made me promise I'd never stand by and watch someone else go through what she went through. When I saw you up there. He shook his head. I couldn't just walk away. I don't expect your gratitude, and I'm not asking you to stay if you don't want to. I'm just offering you a choice. Something those men weren't going to give you. For a long moment, Sarah stood perfectly still, studying this unexpected cowboy who had disrupted all her expectations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the emptying square. In the distance, she could hear a fiddle starting up in the saloon, the sound both mournful and defiant. She thought of her grandmother, of the endless plains where she had once been free, of the uncertain road that stretched before her now. I won't be your slave, she said firmly, each word a declaration of her unbroken spirit. I'm not asking you to be, Thomas replied simply. Sarah took a deep breath, making a decision that terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. Then I'll come to your ranch. Not as a servant. Not as property. But maybe. She paused, searching for the right words. Maybe as someone who needs time to heal. Someone who needs to figure out what comes next. Thomas nodded, relief evident in his face. That's all I'm offering. Time and safety. Nothing more. As they walked together out of Redemption Creek, two unlikely companions bound by circumstance and the fragile thread of mutual respect, neither of them knew that this moment would change both their lives forever. Behind them, the town square emptied in the gathering dusk. Ahead of them, the vast Texas landscape stretched endlessly toward an uncertain horizon, filled with dangers and possibilities they could not yet imagine. The McKenna Ranch, if it could even be called that, consisted of a weathered cabin with a sagging porch, a lean-to stable that housed Thomas's aging mare, and about 40 acres of stubborn Texas soil that seemed determined to grow rocks instead of crops. As they approached in the fading light, Sarah felt a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. At least there were no other people here, no cowboys or ranch hands who might pose additional threats. Just one confused young man who seemed as uncertain about this arrangement as she was. True to his word, Thomas gave Sarah the cabin's only bedroom, a tiny space with a narrow bed and a trunk that held his mother's few possessions. He took his bedroll out to the barn without complaint. That first night, Sarah lay awake on the lumpy mattress, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place, her hand resting on the knife she had managed to conceal in her dress. She had learned never to sleep without a weapon within reach. The next morning, she woke to find Thomas already working in the field, trying to break ground for a late planting. She watched him from the cabin window for a long time, studying his movements, looking for deception or hidden motives. But all she saw was a young man struggling with work that was clearly too much for one person, stopping frequently to wipe sweat from his brow and contemplate his meager progress with visible frustration. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself walking out to the field. Thomas looked up, startled, as she approached. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air, and his hands were already blistered. "You're doing it wrong," she said bluntly. Thomas leaned on his shovel, too exhausted to be offended. "I'm sure I am. Farming isn't exactly my strong suit. I was a telegraph operator back in Missouri, but after the war." He trailed off, shadows passing across his face. Anyway, I came out here thinking I could make a fresh start. Turns out land doesn't care much about good intentions. Sarah crouched down, scooping up a handful of the dry soil and letting it run through her fingers. This land is angry. You're fighting it instead of listening to it. She stood, brushing off her hands. My people knew this land. We knew which plants would grow where, when to plant, how to read the sky and the soil. That knowledge. Her voice caught slightly. That knowledge died with my grandmother. Maybe it doesn't have to, Thomas said quietly. Maybe you remember more than you think. Over the following weeks, an unexpected partnership developed. Sarah, drawing on childhood memories of watching her grandmother and the other women of her tribe, taught Thomas which wild plants were edible, how to read weather patterns, where water might be found underground. In return, Thomas shared what little he knew about working with settlers and traders, about navigating the world of property deeds and legal documents that now governed the land Sarah's ancestors had roamed freely. They developed a careful routine, maintaining boundaries while learning to trust each other in small increments. Thomas never entered the cabin without knocking. Sarah never touched his things without permission. They shared meals but ate in comfortable silence more often than not. Slowly, the rigid walls of suspicion began to crack, though neither acknowledged it openly. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas finally asked the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "What will you do, Sarah? When you're ready to leave?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the wooden porch rail. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "My people are scattered. The government moved most of the Comanche to reservations, places where the spirit dies slowly. I have cousins somewhere in Oklahoma Territory, but I haven't seen them in years. They might not even remember me." She paused, her voice becoming fierce. "I won't go to a reservation. I'd rather die free than live in a cage, even a large one." "You could stay here," Thomas said hesitantly. Not because of how we met. But as a partner. This land is too much for me alone, and you know it better than I ever will. We could build something here. Something real." Sarah turned to look at him, trying to read his intentions in the dying light. "Why would you offer that? You could find a wife, someone from town who would." "Who would what?" Thomas interrupted, a rare flash of anger in his voice. "Someone who would look at me and see a husband instead of a failed farmer. Someone who wouldn't challenge every assumption I make or force me to think about things differently." He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know what you think of me, Sarah. I know you see the man who bought you at auction, and maybe that's all you'll ever see. But these past weeks, working beside you, learning from you, this is the first time since the war that I've felt like I was building something that mattered. Not because of you serving me, but because we're actually partners." "Partners," Sarah repeated the word slowly, testing its weight. It was such a simple concept, yet so revolutionary in a world that saw her as less than human. She thought of her grandmother's final words, of the spirit that no one could cage. Maybe freedom wasn't just about geographical space. Maybe it was about choosing who you stood beside. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful evening. 3 riders emerged from the growing darkness, and Sarah recognized them immediately, men from the auction, men whose bids had been too low, men whose faces still haunted her nightmares. Well, called out the leader, a scarred rancher named Chet Morrison. Heard the telegraph boy bought himself an Indian girl. Wanted to see if the rumors were true. His eyes raked over Sarah with undisguised hunger. "Seems like a waste, keeping her all to yourself out here. Maybe you'd consider selling her. I'll give you $10, 5 times what you paid." Thomas stood slowly, positioning himself between Sarah and the riders. "She's not for sale. She's not anyone's to sell. You need to leave my property." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your property? Boy, you have 40 acres of dust and a shack that's barely standing. You're nobody. Now step aside before this gets unpleasant. Sarah felt the old fear rising in her throat, but alongside it came something new, rage. Pure, burning rage at men like these who thought they could take and take and take. She had been running from this moment since the auction, dreading it, preparing for it. But now that it was here, she found she was tired of being afraid. She stepped out from behind Thomas, her chin raised in that same defiant gesture from the auction platform. "You want to buy me?" she called out, her voice steady and clear. "Then you should know what you're purchasing. You're not buying a slave. You're buying a war. Every day, every moment, I will fight you. I will poison your food. I will set fire to your barns. I will never sleep, and I will make sure you never sleep either. I am the granddaughter of warriors, and I carry their fury in my blood. So ask yourself, is your pride worth a lifetime of watching your back?" The three men exchanged uncertain glances. Morrison's confident sneer faltered slightly. But it was Thomas who surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped forward, his voice ringing with unexpected authority. "And she won't be fighting alone. This is my land, my home, and she's under my protection. You want her? You'll have to go through me. And I promise you, Mr. Morrison, I spent 4 years in the war learning how to kill. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I can still do if I have to." For a long, tense moment, the two sides faced each other in the gathering darkness. Sarah could feel her heart pounding, could sense Thomas trembling slightly beside her, but neither of them backed down. They stood together, two unlikely allies against a world that wanted to break them both. Finally, Morrison spat into the dirt. "You're both crazy," he muttered. "Ain't worth the trouble." He wheeled his horse around, and his companions followed, disappearing into the night with a thunder of hooves and a cloud of dust. When they were gone, Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down heavily on the porch steps, adrenaline draining from her body and leaving her shaking. Thomas sat beside her, his own hands trembling. "That was terrifying," he said with a shaky laugh. "You stood up for me," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "You actually meant it. All of it, the partnership, the protection. It wasn't just words." Thomas looked at her, his blue eyes serious in the starlight. "Of course I meant it. Sarah, I can't undo how we met.